ecology and forest science, both in Georgetown. Thomas grew up in Florence and spent most of his youth exploring the woods and swamps near his home. He later received his BS in biology from Furman, MS in environmental toxicology from Clemson, and PhD in environmental toxicology from Texas Tech University. For the last 32 years, he's worked on various research projects in the United States, Central America, Africa, and Asia, focusing on biology, ectotoxicology, and conservation of wildlife, particularly reptiles and birds. Much of his recent research has focused on the impacts of environmental pollution, habitat alteration, and overexploitation on endangered crocodilians and turtles. For the last 12 years, he has worked with legendary South Carolina biologists Phil Wilkinson and Tom Murphy, studying the American alligator in South Carolina. So we're so happy to have Thomas with us. Yay!
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Debbie, for that nice introduction and for the invitation to speak to the group. And thank you, Alyssa, for getting us all set up today. And thank you all for tuning in. I wasn't aware of the Think and Drink seminar series, but it sounds like one of the few things that came that's good that came out of COVID. So I hope everybody's got a nice cold drink with them and they're relaxed. And again, thanks for letting me be part of this. I want to begin, if I can, for some reason I can't, there we go, by thanking all of our partners and sponsors. I'm not going to go through these, obviously, one by one, but the point of this slide is just to let you all know that things I'll talk about of a group effort. It's collaborations between sponsors, other scientists, students, NGOs, government agencies. A lot of folks have worked together over the years to help fund this research and get this work done. But also, most of all, just again, thank you all for the opportunity. I spoke to the group a few years ago at the call. I had a wonderful time, and it's a lot of fun for me to talk to people that like-minded and that have interest in actually the biology of the animal. Sometimes you talk to different groups and you have different audiences, but this is a real pleasure for me to be speaking with you today. I also want to thank collectively all of our students. That's one of the most gratifying parts of the job, is to work with students on these projects, and all the young minds and the enthusiasm and just the diversity of students that we work with to answer really, really interesting questions related to alligator biology. It's really encouraging to me for our future. In times that seem dark sometimes, being around students like this really, really inspires me and gives me hope. Even during COVID, as we just mentioned, we had students out there getting the work done. So that, fortunately for us, most of our work is done outdoors, and so COVID didn't stop us. And then I want to, Debbie mentioned this in her introduction, but I want to thank some of my mentors. These three gentlemen are the pioneers of alligator research in South Carolina: Tom Murphy, Mark Barrett, and Phil Wilkinson, all retired South Carolina Department of Natural Resources biologists who, starting in the 60s and into the late 90s, worked on alligator biology in South Carolina. In the 70s, alligators were endangered species, and there were federal dollars going into the research of these animals to find out what their conservation needs were. And so Mark was the first, and then followed by Tom and Phil. And Tom and Phil are they're all retired now, but Tom and Phil still actively do research with us on our projects. This past April, we had an alligator symposium. We had one every couple of years up in Georgetown, and we were able to honor all three of these gentlemen. Tom couldn't make the meeting, but he got a plaque and was recognized for their contributions to alligator research and conservation over these last 40 to 50 years. And then last, Lou Gillette. Some of you may have met Lou. He sadly passed in 2015, but he was a world-renowned reproductive biologist studying human health and wildlife health, and his wildlife model was American alligators. He was at the University of Florida for about 25 years, but then moved to Charleston and had a dual appointment with MUSC and the Hollings Marine Laboratory, where he studied human health and wildlife and alligator health, and was able to kind of bridge the two. So he was a great mentor and friend to me, and we sadly miss him, but definitely his legacy lives on with his students. A little about me, as Debbie mentioned, I'm from Florence, South Carolina. I was going to say I grew up in Florence, South Carolina, but I don't think I've ever actually grown up. At least I didn't outgrow my interest in wildlife, and particularly reptiles, as these pictures attest. And fortunately for me, I was able to parlay this interest into a career. Much of my family still wonders how that's possible, but I feel fortunate that I was able to do that. And I've been extremely fortunate to travel around the world to most of my dream locations as a kid that I always wanted to go to when I was younger. I've been able to go there and assist and research, and it's been a great opportunity for me, and incredible time. So very fortunate, and it has to do with, it's not about me, it's about the people that I work with. And that's really the theme of all of this. It's about teamwork and collaboration. But now, as of 2015, I work at the Baruch Institute at the hub called Barony in Georgetown, and I work for Clemson's Research Institute, but also work for DNR. Now they kind of joined forces in 2015 to create a position for a research scientist to do work in the coastal plain of South Carolina, but also focusing on the Yawkey Wildlife Center, which some of us will go to on Saturday. Some of you have been there before. If you haven't, look into it. It's a really cool place. If you don't know where it is, you can see my cursor here. Of course, here's Charleston. Everybody knows what Charleston is. Georgetown's here. My office at Baruch is just across the Waccamaw River here, and the Tom Yawkey Wildlife Center is just south of Winyah Bay. Here's another picture of it. So here's the Yawkey Wildlife Center in green. This is North Island, Cat Island, and South Island. Most of our research takes place on these two islands. This is a wilderness area. It's part of the property, but no one really goes over there anymore, other than the sea turtle surveyors. So most of our work takes place here on these two islands here, and this is where we'll be next Saturday. Winyah Bay to the north, Atlantic Ocean to the east, North Santee River to the south, and Intracoastal Waterway to the west. So it's an island complex, and a really neat place to work. But what makes it so interesting from our perspective, from alligator perspective, is that Phil Wilkinson, mentioned before, began his research there in the late 70s, and he would actually go out and capture and mark and tag and release adult alligators for a variety of different projects as part of his research for DNR. But he maintained that interest, and he would recapture animals in the 90s and the 2000s. And I came on in 2010. And we've been catching animals, recapturing animals he marked as adults almost 40 years ago. So although there's research on crocodilians all over the world, there's in South America, Central America, Asia, Australia, and we have lots of friends that do work all over the world, Yawkey Wildlife Center is the only place on the planet where scientists have animals that have been marked for so long that we can actually begin to look at things about how their age, well, how long they live, but also how their age influences other life history parameters like growth and fertility of eggs and a variety of other things. So because of Phil's work and his interest in continuing this work, he retired from DNR in 1999, but he lives 20 minutes away from the site and goes there all the time to conduct research. And he'll be 89 years old in November, and he's still been out with us last week, so he's still going strong. But it's his work that's made this such a unique place. So today, what I'll talk about, I'm going to bounce around a lot. If you saw me a couple of years ago at Call, you know I talk fast, so I hope you can hang on for a while. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat, and I think Alyssa will collect those and we can get to them at the end. But most of what we do at Yawkey is a combination of descriptive studies where we just go out and monitor what's happening, capture animals, get measurements, look at a variety of different questions like that. Experimental animals in the laboratory or eggs in the laboratory, hatch them out and do different things with the eggs and the hatchlings. And then fortuitous discoveries, which is most of you probably know, some of the world's greatest scientific discoveries have happened by accident. People just happen to stumble on these incredible findings, and we have a lot of those not a lot, but we have a handful of those to share with you today as well. So first, we'll go over some biology of alligators. The first thing to mention is alligators are ectotherms. Most of you know this. They're not cold-blooded, as people say. They're actually ectotherms. And so what that means is that body temperature is determined by their environment. They can't generate internal heat like mammals can. So their bodies are generated. I mean, their temperature is regulated by the environment. So they will use their behavior to regulate that. If it's too cool in the water, they'll go out on the land and bask. If it's too hot, they'll go back in the water. So ectotherms, but not cold-blooded. Everyone wants to know how large alligators get, and there are unofficial records of animals that are 19, 18 feet in length, but none of those have been substantiated. The actual official record length of an American alligator is 14 feet 9.5 inches by an animal that was killed in a hunt in Alabama in 2016. So 14 feet 9.5 is still a very large animal. I've never seen one that big in South Carolina. About the biggest I've ever seen is about 13.5 feet. And those are very, very few and far between. Diet, you probably all know this, but alligators are what we call generalist predators. They're opportunistic predators, so they eat just about anything they can encounter. But there is a what they call ontogenetic difference in diet. That is that the animal's diet changes somewhat as they get larger over their lifetime. Obviously, smaller animals eat smaller prey. Hatchlings eat invertebrates like insects and spiders and then small frogs and minnows and things like that. But as they grow larger, they can take larger prey. And although large alligators can take large prey like white-tailed deer and things like that, they still tend to mostly eat several smaller things like fish. About late March to early April, when the weather begins to warm up in South Carolina, alligators begin to kind of come out of their torpor. They don't hibernate per se. They just kind of go into a torpor. The water's cold, and so their metabolism slows down. They spend most of their time underwater in holes or in dens carved underneath the banks of ditches and ponds. But when it warms up, they come out and they begin to bask and warm up and begin feeding more. And that's when courtship and mating begins. And that alligators, crocodilians in general, but alligators specifically have some of the most elaborate courtship and mating displays of any reptile in the world. This is a photograph of a large male bellowing. If you've ever heard the bellow of an alligator, it's pretty impressive. If you're close to the alligator, it'll probably frighten you. You can feel it. It's like a jet engine being revved up on the runway. But when they do this, they raise their heads out of the water, their tails out of the water, and the vibrations from the bellowing creates a water dance, they call it, where the water shimmers off the back of the alligator, and it's thought to attract the females. But in addition to that, there's a whole series of head rubbing and posturing between the males and the females. But usually the largest males and the largest females are the ones that breed in the best breeding locations. And the breeding takes place in the water, in deep water. And after copulation is over, the males will actually move into kind of different areas, but more open water areas, probably to feed again. And the females stick closer to nesting habitat. And when she's ready, the female will find a suitable nest site to build her nest. Alligators build what's called mound nests, like a mound of vegetation. Some crocodilians, different species, will actually build whole nests, like a sea turtle, just open up a hole on the beach, deposit the eggs, cover it up, and you wouldn't know it was there after a couple of days. Alligators and most crocodilians build mound nests. And she looks for an elevated spot on the bank to avoid flooding. If there's a super high tide or some kind of big rain event, they want to avoid the flooding, so they pick a kind of elevated spot, and usually an area that has an open canopy, so there's a lot more sunlight coming in. And then with her head, tail, and her forelimbs and hind limbs, she'll just knock down this high vegetation and begin to scrape it up into this big mound. And with her body, she'll begin to shape it into this igloo-shaped and sized mound of vegetation. And you'll look and you'll see this picture, this just sea of grass in the marsh. It is now opened up, and so it's almost like a tree falling in the rainforest. What once was this big thick area of vegetation is now this big open spot in it, and we'll get to that later on. But here's what a nest looks like. When she's ready, she'll climb on top of the nest. This may be the same night. It could be a week and a half later. She'll get on top of the nest, and with her hind legs, excavate a hole in the top of the nest, position herself over the top of the nest, and then drop her entire clutch, one egg at a time, into that egg cavity. And this could take an hour or two to occur. Once she's done, she'll cover the hole up and then again walk across the nest, crawl on it, tighten things down, pack it down really nicely, and then the nest remains closed until the eggs hatch 9 weeks later. About 65 days is the incubation period. And the female will stay close to the nest and monitor it and defend it against predators if she can. That's called nest attendance. And I'll get to that a little bit later too. Here's a picture of a nest we opened up just to show you where the clutch is. It's about 10 to 15 centimeters deep in the nest, and the eggs are there. They're hard-shelled eggs. They look kind of like chicken eggs, but they're just longer and more oval shaped. But they're hard-shelled as opposed to sea turtle eggs that are kind of soft. Again, the female will stay with the nest as long as she can. This nest was actually flooded. She didn't know that at the time, but the nest, there was a flood there, but she still stayed with the nest throughout the incubation period. But I would say at Yawkey, at least half, if not a third to maybe half of the nests that are laid are taken by raccoons. They're the number one predator of alligator nests. There are other predators throughout the alligators range. In Florida, you have black bears and wild pigs and even invasive monitor lizards called tegus. In Texas, you've got pigs and you've got coyotes. And in South Carolina, the only thing we've seen so far is raccoons and occasional opossum. Opossums are more scavengers, so they let the raccoons do the dirty work, open the nest up, and they'll come after the raccoons have been there and get the eggs that are left over. But if things go well and the female can keep the predators away, this is what you end up with after 65 days. These little hatchlings that emerge from the eggs, and while they're in the nest, they're inside the egg. If they've not hatched yet, they'll begin to make a sound that sounds like this. And that we think that vocalization does a couple of things. The first thing it does is it synchronizes the hatch. It lets the other hatchlings know it's time to get out of the egg. Let's get out of here now. And the other thing it does is it alerts the female that they're ready to hatch. And so what she does, and these are photographs from Yawkey, is that she'll come to the nest and she'll lay her snout on the nest. And this is something we just kind of noticed. I haven't read this in the literature. This is something we noticed with our camera work. But before she just tears into the nest, she just lays her snout on the nest itself. And alligators' heads are covered in these little black dots that are called integumentary sense organs. These little dots are called ISOs, and they can sense the slightest of vibrations. And we think they're mostly used for detecting prey in the water, but also we think maybe she lays her snout on the nest to feel those vibrations of the young to say, okay, it's time to open the nest. And so when she's ready, she'll actually lean in and with her head and her forelimbs open the nest up, find the clutch, and then very carefully grab each individual hatchling and turn around and walk to the water with it in her mouth to release it. And there are times when hatchlings will move on their own and crawl to the water, but she tries to get them all to the water while she's there, because at that time in life, they're very susceptible to predation. Predators will, everything from herons to egrets to bobcats to other alligators to snakes to frogs to fish, they'll all eat these baby alligators, just like sea turtles are very vulnerable too. This is what you end up with, a baby alligator in the water with that cryptic coloration that allows them to hide very, very well in the tall marsh grass. But despite that coloration, excuse me, they still, very few make it to the first year of life. I would say maybe, just kind of a guess, but we think maybe 10% of the babies that hatch make it the first year. And then of those, maybe, a total of 1% make it to adulthood. So it's a real tough life for these guys, but the strategy is for the female to lay a nest about every other year, and hopefully she can replace herself at least once throughout her lifetime. And she made nests for up to 50 years. So we'll get to that in a second too. The range of the alligator ranges from central Texas all the way to the North Carolina, Virginia border, pretty much throughout the Southeast. If you'll notice, of all the states that alligators occur in, South Carolina is the smallest of those states, but you might be surprised to learn that the density of alligators, the actual number of alligators per unit area of alligators in South Carolina, is as great as, or maybe greater than, those in Florida and Louisiana. And that surprised me as well, but there's a reason for that. And you probably all listening tonight know that reason. This is a habitat I'm sure you're familiar with. Virginia Beach wrote a book about it. Those are all old rice fields, surrounded by brackish marsh. South Carolina is known for its old rice impoundments that were in operation from the late 1600s all the way into the early 1900s. But as the rice culture dwindled in South Carolina, wealthy landowners came down and actually bought the property up and conserved these areas and actually improved them as waterfowl areas, because waterfowl love these shallow ponds to feed in on their migration, or on their winter migration. And so these habitats throughout South Carolina, you've all been to these places, Donnelly and Nemours and you name it, all the down the coast. These impounded wetlands are everywhere, and they're also fantastic habitat for alligators for a variety of reasons. Nesting habitat, feeding grounds. It's a very great place. So without all these impounded wetlands, the density of alligators wouldn't be so great in the South Carolina coastal plain, but it is. It's very great. Here's a picture of that illustration. This is down at Donnelly. Many of you probably, I'm sure you've been there. This is one of their ponds that's been lowered, and of course, that concentrates the fish when this happens, and all the birds and alligators come in to feed. Here's another great shot from Donnelly too. But I get this question quite often, and it depends on the audience, but excuse me, why should I care about alligators? What good are they? And so I have kind of canned responses to that question, depending on who I'm talking to. But to me, the most, and there's aesthetic value and there's economic value and those things, but to me, the most interesting answer to that question is ecological value and the ecological services that alligators and crocodilians in general provide. And so I'm going to go through these very quickly, but keep in mind that a lot of this, what I'm about to talk about, is kind of speculation. I mean, we have data that suggests alligators fulfill these ecological services, but our big challenge now is trying to quantify that. So a lot of our research, and not just mine, but other people too, they're trying to put a number to this and trying to figure, so we can hand this over to land managers and to the public and say, this is why alligators are important. Well, they're not important. They're trying to get the information for that reason. So the first thing is apex predators, right? Alligators are at the top of the food chain. They're considered to be keystone species by some. But the bottom line is, being top level predators, they eat everything in the food chain below them. And in doing so, they do a couple of things. They actually can control prey populations by eating, a certain number of them. But they also tend, like most predators, tend to focus on or tend to capture the diseased and weak in those prey populations. And by doing that, they're actually removing genetically deficient, in many cases, animals from the population, which actually increases the genetic integrity of those prey populations. So it actually improves prey populations, but also keeps them regulated. Secondly, you may have heard the term ecosystem engineers, and other animals do different things to be called that. But alligators, as we mentioned before, build nests, which again, tree in the rainforest, there's a big sea of grass. Now there's this big nest out there. There's a big opening in the marsh. Other animals come to use that space for different reasons. It kind of changes the landscape. You think about hundreds of alligators or thousands of alligators nesting throughout the landscape. It could make a big difference. And those nests are used by a variety of animals, which I'll get to later on for various reasons. Also, alligators, they deepen wallows and create shallow depressions called gator holes. You've heard of those. And also they dig dens beneath the banks of rivers and streams, ditches, and ponds. And those gator holes and those dens retain fresh water. And so during periods of drought, there's water available to other wildlife to drink. That also is cover for animals to hide in. And there's also areas for even animals to breed in. Fish can breed in those water areas. Frogs can breed. So there's a lot of animals do. Also, if you look at the nests, other animals like turtles and snakes will actually lay their eggs in alligator nests. And so there's a lot they do to kind of manipulate the ecosystem, and a lot of animals benefit from that. Now this slide is just to boil it down. It's all about nutrient exchange. And so on the left, you've got alligators living in this, and Yawkey's a good example. You have fresh water on the island. In some places, when you got brackish marshes and you got salt water, alligators feed mostly in the salt water on the coast. They can't stay in salt water very long. They can maybe a few hours for adults, and then you need to go back in and rehydrate or re-equilibrate. But they do go to salt water. And so by going from salt water to brackish water to fresh, to brackish to salt, and then back to fresh again, they're creating these linkages. And every time they feed in fresh water and they move into salt or brackish and they excrete their waste, they're transferring nutrients. And from salt water to fresh water, they're actually moving nutrients from a more nutrient-rich environment to a nutrient-poor environment. And so that's one aspect. The other aspect is, if you think about an alligator, and this is the right side panel with all the animals on it. If you think about the alligator's biology, throughout its entire lifetime, alligators are consumed by both terrestrial animals and by aquatic animals, and they also consume terrestrial and aquatic animals. So there's nutrient exchange from aquatic to terrestrial systems and terrestrial to aquatic systems. And so this is one that we really want to try to quantify, but it's really difficult. But fortunately, we have some new scientists that just have come to Baruch that kind of do this work, and I'm super excited to try to tackle this down the road. It'll be a long-term project, but really, really, really interesting. And then last but not least, alligators as ecological indicators. All this means is alligators as sentinels to environmental health and human health. And this is my background, is wildlife toxicology, studying wildlife for wildlife's sake, but also learning how environmental pollution affects their health and what that tells us about human health. That'll be a talk for a different day, but just suffice it to say, because alligators have a very broad diet, have a very long lifespan comparatively, and they don't move around very much. I mean, they can move several miles, but they don't, migrate to different continents. And so the bottom line is, if you find an alligator that's been exposed to mercury or forever chemicals like PFAS or DDT, whatever chemical you want to look at, chances are it was exposed in the place you found it. So it tells you kind of a little bit about the environment where it was found as well. All right, now let me switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the research we've been doing since about 2010 at Yawkey. Everything we've been doing, but a lot of what we do is been kind of centered around nesting ecology of alligators. And so finding alligator nests, as you might guess, is very difficult if you're just walking around in the woods or you're in a canoe or even in a boat or driving around in a truck. It's very difficult because that tall grass camouflages everything. So we do it by helicopter. And Phil Wilkinson once told me that Mark Barra, the earliest alligator biologist, used to use a canoe to look for alligator nests. And Phil, decided to try the helicopter in the late 70s, and he found more nests in one day than Mark had found in 5 years. So that tells you how difficult they are to find on foot and how good the helicopter is to use. So we fly over the marsh. We do the nesting season for alligators begins in early June. It goes to about early July. And so we fly once a week for about 3 weeks. It takes about 3 hours to fly the entire property. It's expensive. It's about $1,000 an hour to fly this helicopter. We don't fly it. We hire, a pilot. And there's Phil in the front seat looking for alligator nests. But you can see down there, it's, to find a nest, it's difficult unless you're right above it. Here's a shot of what we're looking for. At the top of the page, there's a nest that you see like opening in the marsh. And if you can see it, there's a mound in the middle or kind of the bottom of that little opening. That's an alligator nest. And if you look closely, there's a trail going from the nest to a water hole. And there's a female alligator pointing to the left. And that's the guard hole of the alligator. She'll stay in a guard hole like that if there's one available. Sometimes it's just a pond, sometimes it's a ditch, but in this case, this is a wallow in the middle of the marsh. And she'll stay in that as long as the water stays, it doesn't evaporate, and as long as it's not too salty. She'll stay in that guard hole, and she'll go back and forth to the nest to keep an eye on it. So we look for this big opening in the marsh. When we find it, we hover over the nest. There's the female guarding the nest, and we'll get a GPS coordinate with a handheld unit. And then we'll go to the next one. We'll keep looking. And about 3 hours later, we have a GPS pack full of coordinates. And we go back to the Yawkey, hop in the truck, and we go out in the truck and we head over to the closest road to where the first nest is, and hop out with 2 machetes, and off we go into the marsh to try to find the nest. And we find it, we open it up and look for eggs. And this is what the eggs look like. They're again, long, kind of oblong, oval shaped, hard shelled eggs. You'll notice that there's a white band on some of the eggs. When the alligator lays the egg, the entire egg looks like a light bulb, that gray color on the ends of those eggs, that kind of that grayish color. All the eggs look like that. And the embryo is inside of the egg. It floats to the top like a bubble, attaches to the inside of the eggshell membrane, and begins to develop blood vessels and connect with the eggshell itself. When it does that, it actually makes a little white spot. And that little white spot turns into a band around the egg. And as the embryo continues to grow over the weeks, that white band extends out toward the poles of the egg, the ends of the egg. And after a couple of about 2.5 weeks, the entire egg will be that nice white chalky color. So that's how we tell if the egg's been fertilized or not, is just looking at the banding on the eggs. An egg with no band means it wasn't fertilized. An egg with a band means it was fertilized. A lot of the eggs we put back in the nest and cover it back up and go on our way. But some of the eggs, we've been doing research with Dr. Ben Parrott at the Savannah River Ecology Laboratory in near Aiken, South Carolina for the last 10 years. His lab does a lot of really elegant research. If you don't know this, crocodilians have what's called temperature-dependent sex determination. What that means is the temperature of the nest chamber, incubation temperature, will determine the sex of the babies that are hatched out. And there's a period during that 9-week incubation period, that the middle third of that incubation period is called the thermosensitive period, and that's when the sex is determined. We don't really know how it works yet. We're getting close. It has to do with genes and with temperature and with hormones. There's a lot of different factors involved. But the interesting thing is you can take these eggs into the laboratory, incubate them at a temperature to produce all males or all females. And so for many years, biologists have done this, and Ben's lab is doing some cutting edge research in that field. And this is a talk for a different day, but just to say that a lot of the eggs go back. About every year, I'd say 8 nests we'll take back to the lab, incubate them in the incubator for different studies, hatch the babies out, measure them, weigh them, and then return them to the wild. We also trap adults. Sometimes we trap females on the nest. We want to know who's laying those eggs, and is she using the same nesting area, those kind of things. So that's Phil on the left, putting a walk-through trap on a nest. And then there's me on the right. Years ago, placing a baited trap in a creek to catch adults for mark and recapture. We like to catch as many animals as possible to mark them, measure them, let them go, so we can continue Phil's work that he'd started back in the late 70s. Here's a picture of us pulling in a large male at Yawkey. This is an animal that his name was Truck Biter. He was sadly poached by some hunters in 2012. They were caught, but it would still be lost. He was an animal that had been marked by Phil back in the late 70s, early 80s. So it was a shame to lose him, but we got a lot of good information from Truck Biter. If you go to Yawkey, you'll see Truck Biter's head mounted in the guest visitor center. It was recovered from the poachers. We also get a lot of body measurements that are part of our research project. I won't go through all this now, but we get a lot of length measurements. We get tail girth, head measurements. All this stuff goes into our research to look at growth and a lot of other interesting endpoints. And then we get a blood sample, which is very valuable for a variety of reasons. The blood sample can help us with genetic work, looking at environmental contaminants, hormone biology, immunology, food habits with stable isotopes, and just general health panels, like you would take your pet to the vet to get a general health screen. We do the same thing with alligators sometimes. We'll take a blood sample and run it for many of the same analytes you would run for your pet or even for a human. And so all this informs us about their health and about how they're responding to different stressors in the environment. So now, so some of the things we've been finding over the years, this is kind of the results part of the talk, but we do have a couple of discoveries to describe. Some of the basics, though, the average number of eggs per nest at Yawkey's 44 eggs per nest. We've seen as little as 19 and as many as 60, but the average is a really strong 44 eggs. We've been able to, through genetic work and recapture work, we've been able to determine that some of the clutches, in fact, I think about 40% of the clutches at Yawkey have more than one father. They have multiple sires. It's called multiple paternity. And this has only been reported before in Louisiana, where they reported several nests with more than one father. At Yawkey, we found up to 3 fathers in some cases. And one of the cool things about Yawkey is we have this long-term data set on some of the adults that live there. We can tell you not only that this nest had 3 fathers, we can tell you who they are, or at least one of them, and when he was, how big he is, and is he one of the dominant males? And we're chipping into that. It's really, really interesting information. So that was a pretty neat finding. It takes males about 12 years to reach sexual maturity, but they don't really breed at 12 years because there's much bigger, larger males that will outcompete them for the female. So even though they're physically able to mate at 12, and that 12 years is, variable. It could be 10, it could be 15, but 12 years is kind of the average. They don't really breed until they're almost 24, early 20s. So even though they're able to, they don't, because of the hierarchy and the behavior system of the social system of the alligators. Females take almost 16 years to reproduce, and so much longer. And again, there's a discussion here I won't go into about removing adult females from the population in hunting seasons and so forth. But like turtles, alligators have delayed sexual maturity. It takes them many, many years to reach adulthood, but the hunters want the bigger animals, so they target them. Same with turtles. When you remove those old animals from the population, you're really putting major dents in the reproductive capacity of the population. So it's not a good thing, but that's a different talk for a different day. We think that if we've been able to determine at Yawkey that females, once they reach sexual maturity, can breed for another probably 50 years or so, which is pretty amazing. I'll get to this a little bit later with one individual. And we think the lifespan of alligators in the wild is probably into 70, into the 80s. We have some animals we know that are probably in their late 70s at Yawkey. One cool discovery, this is one of those aha moments. We kind of stumbled onto this information, but I grew up, I'm not sure about you all, but I grew up learning that alligators and crocodilians in general had what's called indeterminate growth. I didn't know it was called that. I just thought it was the word to describe these animals grow until they die. They just keep longer and longer and longer and longer until they die. That's been the dogma for many, many years, but no one's really followed adult alligators throughout their lifetime. So no one knows really for sure if that's the case. And as I mentioned to you, Phil Wilkinson marked a lot of adult alligators back in the late 70s. And this is an animal called, her name is Bertha, because she was the biggest female ever captured on record at the time. She was 9'7" in 1981. She was marked that day, captured, transmitter attached, and released. And over the ensuing years, Phil caught her several, 1993, 2007. I came on board in 2010. We caught her several other times. And you'll notice that her body length, so 9'7" translates to about 293 centimeters. And there's a little room in there for measurement errors, 2 or 3 centimeters on either side. But you'll notice her growth didn't change at all in almost 33 years. And then so we began to look at our data set at other animals that we caught over the 20, 30, 40 years. And it turned out like 31 of 50 animals that had been caught over the long term showed no growth at all for anywhere from 5 to 35 years. So we published a paper on that, and it was a major contribution to the literature, just because no one has been able to follow animals that long. We were able to determine, at least at Yawkey, we think this is probably the case throughout the entire family of crocodilians, or the group of crocodilians, although there's only evidence for a few other species. But we think this is probably the case, that all crocodilians have determinate growth. They grow a certain length and then they stop, kind of like us. We get to a certain height or length and then we stop getting taller. We often get wider, but we don't get much taller, or we don't. In fact, we don't get any taller. Sometimes we get shorter. And what's really cool is last summer we caught Bertha again, the first time in 10 years. We caught her at a nest, and we've been looking for her, but we just didn't see her. And we were so excited to find a nest in this one spot. We put a trap out, and lo and behold, we caught her. And she was, again, 289 within the measurement error of the length. So has still no growth over, and that's 40 years to the year that she was measured the first time. So really cool information on that. Again, shows the value of long-term data sets. And the other cool thing about this is that we think Bertha, her age has been estimated to be probably 78 years old. So she's still breeding. Her nest was a large nest with a lot of eggs in it, and then most of the eggs are fertile. So she's really what we consider to be an old alligator, but still reproducing at a very, very fine rate. Okay, another kind of discovery. I'm kind of bouncing around here, but I'm not sure about you, but the kind of the dogma around the field is alligators do not eat during the wintertime. I mentioned that they go into a kind of a torpor during the winter months. Their body temperature reduces greatly, especially in places like North Carolina and South Carolina. We get the winters that are pretty cold compared to South Florida. We get some pretty cold weather up here. It's very different than down south, obviously. And so if you read these, I've listed all these papers here in the yellow, and these are all very reputable, well-known, famous crocodilian biologists who all said at one point or another that alligators don't feed during the wintertime. Or do they? You may recall in 2018, in January, we had that really crazy cold snap here in South Carolina. We had snow and ice, and then for like the next week, it was below freezing, the average temperature below freezing for about 6 or 7 days straight. Really unusually cold. And about 2 weeks later, we began to see alligators showing up dead at different places in the marsh and so forth. And I got a phone call from my boss at Yawkey and said there's a dead gator there. And we opened it up. We pulled it out to see if it was one that we'd marked before. But I thought, since we have this animal, no one finds alligators during the winter, really. Let's open this thing up. And so those guys opened it up. And lo and behold, we found 2 northern shovelers, a duck species, waterfowl species, 2 northern shovelers in the stomach of this alligator. Wow, that's pretty interesting. Didn't think this happened. So a couple of days later, another dead alligator popped up, opened it up, more waterfowl in the stomach of that alligator. So we spread the word throughout the coastal plain, up and down the coastal plain, to all of our collaborators and friends that if you find a dead alligator, either call us, we'll come, or please, if you feel up to it, feeling kind of adventurous, open these alligators up and look in their stomachs. And so Phil and I went out to Cape Romaine National Wildlife Refuge, Bull Island. I'm sure many of you have been there. And Sarah Dawsey, who's the refuge manager, called us and said, come on out. There were at least 10 large alligators that had died from the freeze. And so we opened all of them up, and we got 20 animals to look at over the entire study, just a kind of a snapshot. But we found that 17 of those stomachs contained fresh food. I'm sorry, 17 contained food, 14 of those contained fresh food. Everything from waterfowl to fresh fish. In the bottom picture, you can see the vertebrae and the fish meat. The top picture is waterfowl. Those are all undigested, partially digested ducks, or some are mottled ducks, some perhaps ruddy ducks. But the bottom 2 of the alligators out there had 4 ducks each in their stomachs. And we had fish, we had crabs. So this is a little small story, but the point is that we were able to show that if you look, you may find something you didn't expect. And alligators are feeding during the winter, at least these alligators were. So we're trying to dig into that a little bit deeper too, and do more research on this winter feeding. And there are implications to that based on the management implications that have to do with that, and growth and hunting limits and things like that I'll get into another day. But really cool finding there too. And then we got a email the next year from somebody that was out at Bull Island again doing some bird watching, and they took a photograph through their scope, and they had a picture of an alligator in February, still a pretty cold day, with a bird in its mouth, probably some kind of waterfowl, a duck, or maybe a coot. But again, this reinforces the idea they are feeding during the wintertime. Now, this is a pretty cool study. I'm going to wrap up with these last two descriptions of a study we've been doing at Yawkey for the last couple of years. Starting in 2019, this gentleman to the bottom, his name is Randeep Singh. He was a master's student at Clemson. He's now a wildlife technician who works for me for the last couple of years. He's a fantastic, remarkable guy that's gung-ho and is really, really bright. Again, I mentioned to you that alligators nest in June, and the eggs hatch in late August, early September, 9 weeks later, 65 days later, almost to the day. And we know alligators, quote unquote, attend their nest, but no one's ever quantified that or looked very closely at that. And so we wanted to learn more about it. And so we tried to examine that. So one of the questions was, when they attend the nest, what are their behaviors? What do they do when they come to the nest? Do they just sit there? Do they walk around? Do they crawl on the nest? And then what are the factors that influence nest attendance? Are they more attentive at night? Are they more attentive during the day? Are they more attentive during the rain when it's dry? What are the factors that influence their nest attendance? So we tried to examine that. Some of the questions, so what we did is we actually evaluated a bunch of different factors during the nesting season. We found the nest, we went to it, and then we measured all these different things. Example, the distance of the nest to water, the salinity of that water, the distance to the nearest tree line where predators could be, the distance to the nearest road where disturbance from vehicles moving by might disturb animals, presence of a guard hole as opposed to a pond or a canal, vegetation density around the nest. If it's real compact, does it provide more cover? Does she feel more comfortable that way? Or if it's sparse, does she feel more threatened? A canopy cover, is the nest in the shade or is it in the sun? Does that make a difference between her behaviors? And then environmental factors like time of day. Is she there more at night, more in the daytime? Ambient temperature, is she there more when it's hotter or when it's cooler? Some of these things seem intuitive, but you don't know until you test them. Rainfall, is the female there during periods of rain or after rain, or is she there when it's drier? And then cloud cover, does she come up more often on cloudy days or rainy days or sunny days? So we went out there and we measured all these things. We measured distance to water, and we measured vegetative density and temperature of these temperature loggers and salinity of the water every 2 weeks, and canopy cover, the shade of the nest, and so forth. Did all that stuff. But the main thing we did, in addition to that, is we put a game camera up on every nest. There were 25 nests. We put a game camera on every nest, and each camera was set to take a picture every minute for the entire incubation period. So that's 1 minute for 9 weeks. Every minute for 9 weeks is a lot of pictures. And Randeep had the pleasure of going through those one by one. It was over 2.5 million pictures almost. But this is a picture of Randeep very carefully going up to the camera to get the camera out, to get the card out, and to change the batteries. And the alligator, the female, was defending. And so my job was to distract her. And this didn't happen very often, but it does happen every now and then. But Randeep, I call him Randeep the Brave, because he didn't shirk his task. He did it very willingly. And there's Randeep in a safe place, very happy. Before he learned he had to go through 2.34 million pictures, but he did a great job with it. And we've got some really cool information to share. So we found 3 primary behaviors of the alligators on the nest during nest attendance. And this is, again, once the eggs are laid, covers the nest up. This is late June to about early or late August. The first is what we call observing the nest, observation. So you see the female in the background, her eyes are, the eye shine is illuminated by the camera. She's there, but she's not on the nest. She just kind of sits in it from a distance and watches the nest. And this behavior was almost by far the most common behavior of what we saw. 80% of the time she was at the nest, she was just observing from a distance. She didn't crawl on the nest. But crawling on the nest was the second most prominent behavior. I think around 20%. I can't read my writing there; it's covered up with some stuff. But I think it's around 20% of the nest, the females crawled on them. But the majority of that crawling took place in the first 3 weeks of the nesting season. So she built the nest, laid the eggs, and she crawled around it and visited a lot. After that 3rd week, she began just to do mostly observational attendance from a distance. And then defending the nest. That's basically when the predator comes and the female feels that her nest is threatened. We didn't see a lot of that, but we saw some of it. Sometimes it was against us. But this is a few pictures to kind of illustrate this. But This is a juvenile alligator, about a 4.5 foot or 5 footer on the nest. She just walked up and was basking on the nest to get some sunshine. In the background, you may not be able to see this, but the female is in the back, kind of right. Because right here, that's her right there. This is her guard hole, and she's right back there. And if you look at the time, I think it's like 10 o'clock, or I don't know what, I can't read it because there's stuff in front of my screen. But she immediately popped out, boom, and that other gator was gone. She came out pretty fast. You can see the wake in her behind her. The white water foamed up. She jumped up, climbed up on the nest, hung out for a little while, laid there, and then just stayed for a little while, and then finally turned aside, went back to her hole. But they will defend the nest against other alligators basking, raccoons, people. But even when they do that, they're not always successful, because sometimes the nests are not in. This animal was very vigilant because the nest was surrounded by water. This nest was actually flooded. She didn't know it, but this nest was around water, so she could go to it and stay close by without getting too hot. A lot of the nests take it's a good walk from the guard hole to the nest. Alligators during the daytime get really hot and overheat, so they can't be as vigilant. And so sometimes the predators come during the daytime and they raid the nest at that point. So what we found was, as far as the factors go, that really the main factor that influenced nest attendance was distance to water. So basically, as you might guess, the closer the nest was to a water source, the more the female attended the nest. It seems intuitive, makes good sense. Salinity had a weak effect. So if the nest was, if the water in the guard hole got to about 15 parts per thousand, seawater is about 35, about 15 parts per thousand, the female would leave. She couldn't handle the water, she'd take off. So nest attendance would drop, but that didn't happen very often. So distance to water was the main factor. And then from an environmental standpoint, the other ones you might guess, time of day, she was there more often at night. Ambient temperature, of course, it's cooler at night, so she was there at cooler temperatures. And rainfall, whenever it rained, they seem to come to the nest more often, we think, again, because it cools things down a little bit. So we're working on that paper right now to try to publish that. And then this is my last thing. I'll wrap this up. But with those cameras on the nest, we saw so many cool things we wanted to share. But one of them, as I mentioned before, is when alligators build their nest, other wildlife, we for sure must use those nest sites. We use those nests. But no one has really quantified that or even looked at it. So we had, all those millions of pictures of the nest during the incubation period. So Randy went through and looked at this, and he's still going through them now, but we're trying to quantify what animals were there and what their behaviors were. So in addition to providing food for predators like raccoons and possums, other animals, this is just a bunch of animals. I thought you guys would like it because you're naturalists and like different species, but this is a screech owl on a nest, we think perching and maybe looking for prey from a higher spot in the marsh. This is a marsh rabbit feeding on this new vegetation that's come up on the nest, this green vegetation. This is pretty common with rabbits and also deer. They'll feed on these new vines and forbs on the nest. And then from a bird perspective, we're up to 58 species of birds that have been seen on the nest or in the nest site. These are just a small sample. The black vulture, woodcock, clapper rail, black crowned night heron, mottled duck, and a white ibis, but so many more. I can tell you that the list it's an amazing list of birds. Here's a family of black-belly whistling ducks, and I think the brood's about 13 to 14 individuals that have been in the marsh, and they seem to be using the nest as kind of a place to rest and dry off a little bit. Here's the big group of common grackles and a few red-winged blackbirds foraging at a nest site. Here's a juvenile, I think, black crowned night heron feeding on a fiddler crab. Fiddler crabs will also burrow into the nest and use the nest areas for their own tunnels and so forth if it's close enough to salt water. But it's a foraging area for the birds. Mammals, up to 9 species of mammals, including bobcats, white-tailed deer, river otters, opossums, marsh rabbits. At least we have rice rats and wood rats, and maybe even roof rats too. We're still trying to get some of these identified, but a fair amount of mammal activity at the nests, not including raccoons, of course. There's an opossum going in for an egg. Rice rats on the nest. And then again, a male buck, white-tailed deer drinking and feeding on vegetation by the nest. And then from reptiles and amphibians, we got at least 3 frog species, bullfrog or pig frog. We're not sure in some cases because they're just similar. You kind of have to have them in hand sometimes to tell them apart. But also leopard frogs and cricket frogs. I'm sorry, green tree frogs. maybe others too. You'll see why in a minute. And then also we have turtles. We've got yellow-bellied sliders and eastern mud turtles use the nest. Eastern mud turtles, we actually documented laying eggs in alligator nests. And then up to 12 snake species using the nest sites for different things, mostly basking, but other possibilities too. Cottonmouths and racers, black racers were the most common. There's a nice cool picture of a racer with his head raised on the nest. And then here's a cool picture of lots of frogs around on the nest and around the nest area, probably breeding, courtship, and probably some feeding of invertebrates too on the nest site. And we think, again, we're trying to quantify all the different behaviors, but we think that they're actually doing a lot of foraging. On the top left photograph is a screech owl looking down at a rice rat. In the next photograph, you don't see this, but the owl is now here and the rat's gone. So we don't know if it caught the rat got away, but I think it's foraging on this rat. The rat comes there for its foraging, and then the owl in turn forages on the rat. This is a Cooper's hawk feeding on some kind of marsh bird. It's using the nest as a feeding platform. An opossum feeding on eggs. White-tailed deer feeding on vegetation. A bobcat, for the first time ever been documented feeding on young. This is an egg with the hatchling in it. So the bobcat's feeding on the hatchlings, not the egg. And here's a Carolina wren feeding on the remains of a hatched eggshell. And just to wrap things up, we're doing a lot more than what I've discussed today. I got lots more things to tell you about next time if you're interested, or maybe on Saturday we'll talk about it on the field trip. But we're looking at a lot of things to do with alligator-human interactions, human-alligator conflict, trying to reduce, negative interactions between people and alligators. And that involves space use, doing tracking and looking at how they use their environment with transmitters and so forth. We do population dynamics work, looking at the numbers of alligators in different habitats, size classes, how many adults, how many juveniles, how many hatchlings, and sex ratios, which can be possibly impacted by climate change down the road. And then lastly, other things like growth, reproduction, diet, and exposure to pesticides. I could give you a talk all day about those things, but I know we're running out of time, so I will close my mouth. Thank you again for your attention. If you have any questions, if there's time, please feel free to ask. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Thomas. That was awesome. And I know I learned a lot more in this last hour than I have in the last few weeks. But we do have a few questions I want to cover, since just for the sake of time, we'll jump right into it. Paula was asking that we have a few pods of hatchlings out at Kaw. The mothers seem to also have yearlings and older young. Are all of these hers, or do they come from other animals? Or from other females, I mean.
That is a great question. And the short answer is I don't know. We've seen evidence at Yawkey, because part of our research, again, is to take eggs into captivity, hatch them out, and then release them back into the wild. And we've done that. And we've seen females that are not the mother of these babies that will come and protect them. They'll come. So we think, and I'm not sure how much this has been published or noticed before, but we think that in general, females will protect hatchlings. They won't eat their hatchlings or other hatchlings. But other adult alligators, males will eat hatchlings, and the small juveniles, the 2-year-olds love that. They eat the hatchlings too. So the ones you saw, it's very possible. I don't know for sure, but it's possible that the larger the yearlings or the 2-year-olds, either if they are from the same mom, maybe they don't bother them. I don't know if that's true. I've never heard of that. The ones I've seen have eaten other small ones, or maybe they don't do that when the female's around because she'll take care of them, or maybe they're just more interested in something else. Maybe they're basking and they're full and they're not hungry at the time. But I don't know for sure. But the small ones I would guess are probably hers, because she'll stay with them for up to a year, maybe sometimes a year and a half if she can.
Awesome. I will say too, Katie said there was amazing footage of alligator breeding displays in the America the Beautiful doc series, and some of it was filmed at Yawkey. She said you could probably find that on Disney Plus and Nat Geographic. So if anyone's interested in seeing that. Then Debbie asked, how big are the babies as they get out of the egg?
They're about, let's see, 10 inches. That's a good, that's, about 10 inches or so, 9 to 10 inches in length. I should know that in centimeters in my head, but I don't want to embarrass myself. But it's, yeah, but they're really small. I've got about 20 of them over here on my back porch that we're releasing tomorrow morning at Yawkey. That I would love to save for you guys coming Saturday, but it's real important to get them out on the same time schedule as the ones that got released the last couple of weeks, but they're very small, and that's why they're so vulnerable to predators. Is that, and they're pretty much they don't have much of a defense. Their best defense is to hide, and mom hanging around. So not many of them make it.
And following up on that question, this was when you were talking about how you go through the nests and inventory the eggs. Debbie was asking, what does the female alligator do when you guys are collecting the eggs?
Another great question. So it's really, well, Yawkees is a little bit different because there's been so much capture of adult animals there for research purposes. Most of, not all, but a lot of the female alligators have been captured before. I mean, it seems strange to think that, but there's a lot of gators there that have been captured. It's a big place. We've been doing this for a long time. So I would say only once or twice a year do we get chased by, or does the female actually defend against us. Most of the females, they're around, but they don't come for us. But what's interesting is we'll actually go there and do our thing, and we'll take the eggs and we'll let them, whatever we're doing at the nest, whether it's measuring or checking the camera, whatever, we'll do that, and then we'll leave. And then we get the camera the next week and we'll look at the pictures, and it shows that there we are. And then the next 2 minutes later, the gator's there. She's around. She comes back, but she just doesn't really. And we're looking for her. I mean, we know kind of where the trail is and where the guard holes are, and so we're being real careful. But there have been times we've been. The one picture of Ran Deep where the gators turned toward him. She was a new one. She'd never been caught before, and so those are the ones that are really bold, and we have to kind of be really careful about where she is, and sometimes have to distract her so she won't. But the important thing to note here is all she wants us to do is stay away from her nest. There have been times where I've been between her and the guard holes. She'll come out and she'll chase me past the nest. Once I pass the nest, she stops at the nest. She doesn't want to chase me down the trail. She doesn't want to bite me or eat me. All she wants to do is me get away from the nest. The same with babies. If you pick up a baby alligator, Phil told a story about one time he had one in his hand and he was, backing up, and the gator was coming after him and kept coming down the trail. Finally, he just dropped the baby, and the female just stopped, picked the baby up, and went back the other direction. So all they want to do is keep their nest safe and the baby safe. They don't really want to mess with us unless they have to. So it doesn't happen very often.
That's pretty cool, though, and very brave of you guys.
Well, believe me, we're very careful going in there. We know that, working with any kind of animal, especially these kind of animals, whenever you get complacent or get kind of lackadaisical, that's when problems arise. Yep. Try to be real careful.
That's when trouble happens.
Exactly.
Terry asked, do the alligators reuse nesting sites over time? Excellent
question. That's called nest site fidelity. I'm sure you probably already know that. I keep forgetting I'm talking to naturalists here. You probably know more about it than I do. But yes, they do. It's and we're trying to quantify that too. And we have a data set with sometimes one female who's nested like 5 or 6 times in the last 10 years, and her nest is all within maybe 100 meters of each other. Or they don't often use the exact same site, and they can't 2 years in a row because they knock down so much vegetation in year one, where they come back the next year, it would still be open. The grass hasn't grown back yet. It takes a while to grow back. So, but she may nest right next to it, but they tend to maybe the same pond, or most of them nest pretty close to where they have. In fact, Bertha, that big one that I showed you that we caught so many years later, she's been in the same nesting area for the last 40 years. I mean, the nest may be 20, 30 yards apart, but they're very close.
Wow, that's super cool. And then we have another question about nests. Catherine asked, if a nest is flooded, does that always kill the eggs? And if they are dead, when does the mother realize that? And what does she do about it?
Also, really interesting question. So I think to the best of our knowledge, eggs can be submerged in water for maybe an hour, maybe. I mean, I could be wrong. It could be a little bit longer, maybe less, but not much longer than that before the hatchlings will I mean, maybe, I don't know, but not very long before the young will perish. There's some turtle species that nest the eggs can be in the water for 5 months, and they do have no problem. But crocodilians can't do that. So any submergence for more than a few hours usually results in the death of the young. In terms of her understanding what's going on, we're learning that now with these cameras, because what we're seeing just today, I've seen I was sent photographs that Randy's going through with a female has come back to her nest even a month after the fact. And so we need to go through all the pictures, but there's evidence that she comes back. I'm not sure if it's hormonally controlled. It probably is, but they come back, and they keep coming back until they maybe listen for the vocalizations of the young. In some cases, maybe she digs in and finds them. But there have been some studies that have shown that in some cases, females will actually consume the eggs if she finds them unhatched, or in some cases, raccoons will predate a nest, and the eggshells will be everywhere outside the nest. And some eggs didn't hatch. Maybe she'll eat those, but I don't know how common that is. And that's probably just because, we're just not getting where we can use these game cameras and actually, see this from a distance. And so, but in general, not really sure if she recognized the fact, okay, these eggs didn't hatch, and I'm going to just either eat them or leave them alone.
So something to keep learning in research,
Right,
for sure. Yeah.
For sure.
And just in case anyone has to hop off, we have one more question, but Debbie did drop the link in the chat for the walk and talk sign up for Saturday. What time does it start? I think you guys are meeting at Tom Yaki's, but
Yeah, we're
Oh,
go ahead. I was gonna say we're going to meet at the boat landing, at the South Island boat landing in Georgetown at 9 o'clock, right? Debbie, is that right?
yes.
awesome. So everyone in the chat tonight can access that, and then we'll send it out to other folks tomorrow morning, but you guys get first access. And so the last question we had is from Ed. He said, have you ever considered using drones to find nests instead of helicopters?
Yes, we have. Another great question. And we've actually taken drones out there and tried it. And one of the guys that works at Baruch with me, he's a kind of a biogeochemist, nothing to do with wildlife or alligators, but he looks at gas flux in marshes, and has all these towers, all these machines that measure all these different things. And part of what he does is he uses drones to map out all these marshes there. Anyway, he's got these really nice drones, really like four props, I mean, really good ones. And these big batteries for them. So we went out there one day to try to see how efficient it was, and it worked pretty well. I mean, we were actually able to find nests, but the problem right now is that the battery life on these drones is not strong enough that it would take us days and days and days to get the information that we can get in 3 hours with helicopters. And I think it's going to eventually be there. We'll be able to do it, but right now it's not quite there yet. Because in a lot of cases we want to find the nests as soon as they're laid. And so sometimes we try to find them before the eggs are even put in the nest, because we want to get the eggs in the incubators before they begin to develop. And so in a lot of cases, time is a factor for us to get them as soon as possible. And with the drones, we would need to do that, several days in a row to get all the spots on Yawkey covered. But I have no doubt that at some point that's going to be achievable. And also, there are other applications for the drones we can use. For example, once we find a nest, we can stand on the bank of the dike of that impoundment and fly the drone over there and say, is the female there? And we can get photographs and determine, and there's a lot of applications we can use for that. But for finding the nest right now, I think that's just not quite there yet.
We'll give it about a year or two, and then I bet it'll get there with how fast we're moving these days.
Yeah,
right?
for sure. That would be great.
There's no other questions in the chat, but if anyone wants to come off mute and ask anything, we're almost at 8:10, so we don't want to keep Thomas too long, but
I'm fine. Sorry I went so long. I always try to cut. I mean, this talk was actually longer. I had to cut stuff out. There's just so much stuff to talk about. So
we tend to do that as naturalists. We just get so passionate about it that you lose track of time. But
yeah. But thanks for being patient. And
of course. No, we really appreciate your time. And like I said, I learned a lot in the last hour that I had no idea about. And I've lived in the Low Country for a while now.
Well, good. Makes me feel good. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all, and look forward to seeing some of you on Saturday, and hopefully the rest of you some other time down the road, either at Yawkey or at a meeting or somewhere. But hope we cross paths soon. And thanks again for your time.
This was great, Thomas. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks
Thank you.
again,
Bye-bye.
Thomas.
All
Have
right.
a good
Take
night.
care. You too.